Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. The issue at hand is, as you know, is one of the most threatening, if not frightening, not only to international order, but mainly, of course, to the Islamic world, the Islamic Muslim community. And it really begs the question as to why now? Why has this paroxysm of violence erupted in the last decade or so? Why was this not a recurrent feature in Sunni-Shia relationships across the centuries? One of the common epithets that you get from the mainline media is that these are age-old differences and age-old quarrels, and this violence is endemic to the Islamic world, and that the differences between the Sunnis and the Shias had always been and had always featured as part and parcel of the history of Islam. This is, of course, very, very far from the truth. I've done a lot of research on the incidence of Sunni-Shia violence of this scale that we are witnessing now over time. And there are, of course, spikes, and sometimes very, very long spikes of violence. But it certainly has not been the common experience of Muslims throughout the generations of this kind of endemic warfare. In fact, if truth be told, in Orthodox Islam, it was extremely difficult and, in fact, reprehensible to consider a person non-Muslim if that person declared the Shahada, that is, there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet. There's a number of very, very critical treatises that were written on the subject by the most foremost of which is by the medieval theologian and master Al-Ghazali, where he said categorically that unless very, very rare and difficult exceptions are brought, it is impossible to consider somebody a non-Muslim if he declares himself to be one. The Ahl al-Qibla, the people who bow in prayer to Mecca, are one irrespective of what the theologians say. So the history of Sunni-Shia relationships is not one of amity. I would not describe it as such. It was one of accommodation, where each party recognized the differences, did not celebrate these differences, but recognized the boundaries and the limits that constrained behavior. There were outbreaks of rioting, sometimes in major towns of the Islamic world where the two communities were represented. But by and large, whenever there was a significant spike in violence, it was due to outside forces, not necessarily inherently built into the society itself. They happened, as I said, infrequently. Once in the period when Salahuddin Saladin overturned the Shia Fatimid dynasty, there was a period of forced conversion. And at the same time, the introduction and the imposition of Shiism on Iran also had with it periods of violence. But apart from these two major events in Islamic history, Sunni-Shia relationships were one of accommodation. So, why are we now in this situation? Why? I think it's for a variety of reasons. I don't have time to discuss them in detail, but I'll name four. One is the rise of hitherto disempowered or marginalized groups. They have been marginalized, particularly in the context of the modern nation state. And I'm speaking here specifically in terms of Iraq and Bahrain, and from the other side of the spectrum in Syria. Sunni-Shia differences have reached the point of violent confrontations in Iraq and in Syria, and in Pakistan to a lesser extent, but it was not in the form of a struggle for power. So factor number one is that we have the rise for whatever reason, of formerly or hitherto marginalized and disempowered groups. The second factor is regional rivalries, and I'm not going to belittle that. There is a war, or a kind of Cold War, fought by proxy in the Middle East between regional powers. These regional powers do use their sectarian affiliations and affinities in order to extend their range of power and influence. The third factor is the rise of what I call the takfiri ideology, the ideology that rejects all forms of Islam except the one that is propounded by this narrow group of people. And here I'm not going to mince words. It is what I would call the Wahhabi explosion that has taken place over the last 20 or 30 years. Wahhabism, apart from the modern period, was limited and constrained to the Arabian Peninsula and did not extend out of it, except when it tried to confront Ottoman power. The leader of the then Wahhabi state in the early 19th century was dragged in chains to Istanbul, where he was tried by scholars from the 4 different madhabs of Sunni Islam and put to death for propounding a heresy. Wahhabism stayed bottled up in the wilds of Najd until Ibn Saud took over the Arabian Peninsula, and it became part and parcel of Saudi foreign policy. Now we have, the effects were also limited until the oil era came upon us, and until it began to be used as part of the Saudi ascendancy in the world of Islam. And this happened specifically after the revolution in Iran in 1979. So now we have the growth of an ideology that demonizes and that shuns those who don't subscribe to the same premises. We have an ideology that is at the service of the foreign policy interests of a local power. Aligned to that is the rise of jihadi groups, nihilists I call them, who have used this ideology for whatever motives they may have had to confront those whom they object to. First, it was the far enemy, the United States, and latterly in the last decade, it has been the near enemy, and here we are talking about the Shias, which is a very, very important element of the mobilization of jihadis across the world, is the anti-Shia venom. We have in the Western world the sense that these people are only after what those in the West cherish most, but in reality their focus nowadays is much more on groups inside these countries in which they are fighting their wars mainly through terror. And it is these groups who are targeted. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in Iraq as a result of terror bombings, and thousands more have been killed in Pakistan over the last 20 years. What is the manifestations of this Sunni-Shia divide that we have now? How is it manifested in political life? Well, first of all, it challenges established political power and authority in a number of countries. So there is a drive to power and a drive to resist, drive to power by disempowered groups, and a drive to resist by those who hold power and privilege. We see also the regional rivalries expressing itself in the form of funding, logistical support, material support, and training for various groups, some of them terrorists, some of them fighters who are part of this nexus. And on the ground, it expresses itself in individual killings, mass killings, terror attacks, and increasingly and unfortunately ethnic cleansing or sectarian cleansing. Entire areas of Iraq now are denuded of one sect or another, and the same thing is beginning to happen in Syria. what do we do if we leave this situation untended? Why shouldn't we just leave it unabated? Why should the world really care if Muslims in their various forms tear each other apart? Well, from the Islamic perspective, from the Muslim perspective, this continuing demonization, and here I want to say something that may not appear to be objective, but we have to take into account that there's a disproportionality in terms of which community suffers what. I'm not in the business of weighing deaths against each other, but there is a disproportionality here, and what is happening in the Muslim world is not that the Sunnis are being demonized, but it's the Shia that are being demonized. And there's a significant cultural shift taking place in the last few years, decades, where Sunni thought, mainstream Sunni thought, that found a place in its theology and in its practice for Shia Islam, now finds it impossible to accommodate. I'll just give you one example of a situation that had happened in the past, not the recent past, but it is inconceivable that it can happen again. In 1931, as the encroachments of the Zionist project in Palestine became more and more obvious, a congress was held in Jerusalem by the remnants of the Pan-Islamic movement. And that congress, the organizers of that congress, included the leading lights of the Muslim world at that time, people like Rashid Rida, the Ali brothers from India, and they invited groups from all the then independent Muslim countries, as well as from those who were living under imperial rule. And the Jerusalem Congress was held in Jerusalem in 1931, attended by mainly delegates from the Sunni world, but also a significant participation from Iran and from Iraq. At the prayer time, Rashid Rida, who is one of the founding lights, as it were, of modern Salafism, the modern strict interpretation of Islamic orthodoxy, willingly gave up the leadership of the prayer, and this is a big thing amongst those who are religiously inclined, to a leading alim, a leading scholar from Iraq, Muhammad Hussein Kashif al-Ghata. And they all lined up in prayer behind this person, a Shia alim, behind him a large number of people who were Sunnis. This is inconceivable now. Inconceivable in an official setting. It might happen individually, it might happen in small communities, but officially I cannot ever envisage that, for example, a chief alim of Saudi Arabia would stand in prayer behind a chief alim from Najaf or Qom or Mashhad. So the demonization aspect of it, the shunning aspect of it, has profound consequences. I believe that the end result is to consider a group of Muslims, maybe up to 20% of the Muslim population, non-Muslims by the others. Now this you say, well, so what? One group shuns the other, but it destroys whatever limited chance there is of creating an Islamic space in which all Muslims can participate. And this sense of mutual incomprehension and divisions is growing. It's growing, splitting families. Many families in Iraq have both Shia and Sunni members. Splitting communities, it's splitting cities, and will ultimately split societies and undermine nations and undermine states. Already 2 countries in the Middle East, and probably a third one on the way, can only think in terms of sectarian terms. The idea of the nation state acting as an accommodating form for various sects and ethnicities and religions is under serious, serious threat. So how does one contain it? First of all, the rise of marginalized and disempowered groups has to be confronted head-on. Rights, political rights, civil rights, human rights have to be afforded those groups, whether they are majorities or minorities, that have felt disempowered. The regional rivalries that exist, and here in particular between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I mean, it cannot be resolved simply by statements and by proclamations. It has to be resolved politically again over the long run by a sense of recognizing the space in which each party can operate and maneuver within some form of balance of power, amicable balance of power consideration. The third way, I think, which is a very significant way, is to counter the ideology of the Wahhabis. And this can only happen not at the hands of the Shia. The Shia will never be able to convince those influenced by Wahhabi thought to change their minds. It is the world of the Sunni orthodoxy, the world of traditional Islam, that has to confront this. Now, there are glimmers that this is taking place. There are glimmers of hope that the orthodoxy, traditionally minded people, even those who have a modern conception of Islam, are beginning to see the mortal threat that can be faced by this power if it's not contained. The third way, the fourth way, is to confront openly and defiantly what these people are claiming, what these people assume to be their interpretation of Islam. I don't want to go into polemics as to why I think this is a barren and an empty and a civilizationally nil form of Islam. All you have to do is to look in the past 300 years and see whether there are any great artists, poets, architects, any creativity that has emerged out of this kind of barren thinking. But we have to confront it, and we have to confront it in a defiant way. Lastly, how to transcend it, how to accommodate it, how to create a new ecumen, as it were, between the Sunnah and the Shia. Well, education is by far the most important. And education really doesn't start at the school, it starts at the home. Tolerance and accommodation is taught within families. It's not necessarily taught in a school curriculum. I think we have to look at the 1,000-year history of traditional orthodoxy and understand that this traditional orthodoxy must not be thrown out. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a great deal of good, and there's a great deal of wisdom in the way that our antecedents handled these problems. Lastly, it is to do with the state. Now, you might say, why can't a non-sectarian, aggressively secular state solve this problem? Well, it hasn't. Syria was such a state. So was Iraq for nearly 30, 40 years. These things simmer on. And it is also problematic to see how the state, by assuming it is secular in a religiously minded population, can transcend sectarian issues. What I think, the last point I'll make before I close, is what I think should be the starting point of a new order, as it were, between the Sunnah and the Shia, is going back to the future, as it were. In 2004, in the beginning of the Iraq sectarian conflict, a number of very, very significant ulamas met in Amman, both from the Shia and the Sunni communities, and produced something called the Amman Message. It was, I think, one of the most significant documents that has been produced for decades. And it makes it very clear what are the acceptable parameters in which Islamic discourse can be undertaken. And it certainly excludes a lot of the thinking that is now encompassed within Takfiri ideology. This message was signed not only by leading religious figures, but also by governments. We have to resurrect that Amman message. The way that the Helsinki protocols were resurrected in the Cold War and used to undermine totalitarian rule in Eastern Europe. We had a Helsinki Watch of the 1970s, and I'm calling now for the rebirth of the Amman message and the establishment of the Amman Watch Committee to examine and see acts that have been taken against the purported interests of those who had signed that document. Thank you.